My parents made me work 2 diner jobs while paying for my sister's study abroad expenses in her room. I discovered documents from my father addressed to May. She screamed, "Don't look at that!" But it was too late. I cut off all ties with them. I never imagined I would find a letter that would change everything. While cleaning out my childhood bedroom, my name is Emily until that moment. I thought I completely understood my role and position within my family. I was their responsible, dependable one. I believed my purpose was to support my stepsister, Sandy, from behind. As she chased her dreams, "Emily, don't forget to check the back of the closet," I heard my stepmother's voice from downstairs with her usual mix of sweetness and authority. "If you find anything from your old school, we might be able to donate it." With a sigh, I pushed another box toward the door. I hadn't needed reminders about thorough cleaning in years, but that was just my stepmother's nature. She couldn't resist giving directions and maintaining control over everything. Even now, as I helped prepare them to move into a smaller house, she hadn't stopped while organizing the nearly empty closet. My fingers brushed against something tucked behind the baseboard. At the back of the closet was a slightly yellowed envelope, worn. With age, I recognized it immediately. It had my name written in my late father's L in handwriting. I pulled the letter out and carefully opened the seal. My hands trembled as I took extra care not to tear the old paper. The moment I saw the date at the top, my heart began to race. It had been written just weeks before my father passed away to my beloved daughter, Emily. If you are reading this letter, it means my wish has not been fulfilled. I asked your stepmother to give you the college fund I had prepared. For you totaling that, money is meant for you alone to help you pursue your dreams. It pained me to see your stepmother favor Sandy, dimming your light in the process. I hope this money helps you regain that brilliance. As you read on, tears blurred the words. On the page, a college fund my stepmother had always said, "We don't have enough money to send both of you to college." They told me that I needed to work to support C's education. I accepted it as my role. In the family, something that seemed natural at the time, but hidden within that role, was a secret. I hadn't known my father and stepmother got married 5 years ago, when my father, who had raised me on his own, said he wanted to remarry. I was genuinely happy. I was excited about having a stepsister and a new mom, but that feeling didn't last long. Miss Stepmother only cared for Sandy. Their Asen was simple. I wasn't her biological child. My father on this too, and often clashed with her whenever they fought. He would apologize to me and take me to places I wanted to go. It seemed like he was even considering divorce. But a year ago, he passed away in an accident. With my biological mother already gone, he essentially became an orphan. That's when my life truly became a nightmare. Let me get back to the story. As I stood in shock after reading the letter, I heard my stepmother's voice. Emily, her voice was closer this time. She was probably wondering why I was taking so long. Upstairs, I quickly folded the letter and shoved it into my pocket. My heart pounded as I heard her footsteps approaching. For the past year, my stepmother had hidden the existence of this letter while my stepsister Sandy attended her dream school. I worked as a waitress at a diner and took on cleaning jobs as well. Even seeing this, Miss Stepmother never said a word. "Yes, I'm here," I called out in a voice calmer than I expected when my stepmother entered. The room, I pretended to have found some old documents my hand stayed firmly on. The letter in my pocket. My father had tried to give me a future, but my stepmother had stolen it from me. The person standing in front of her then was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter used to be, having learned the truth. I was becoming someone entirely new, someone seeking answers, and perhaps even revenge. I slowly looked around. My childhood bedroom. One last time. Nothing could remain as it was anymore. I had been blind to the truth hidden in this room all along. Now I had found it. There was no turning back. I waited until dinner to bring out the letter when I placed it on the kitchen table. My palms were damp with sweat. My stepmother, as she did every evening, was carefully arranging the placements. Meanwhile, my stepsister Sandy was probably texting her college friends while I was cleaning. Today, I found something interesting. E began striving to keep my voice steady, a letter from my dad. My stepmother's hands froze in place, an ear-piercing silence filled the air. She didn't turn around, but I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. "It's just a letter," I said. "But it talks about a college fund." I pushed the letter forward. "He left $50,000 for me," at those words. Sandy looked up in surprise. Her hand stopped texting on her phone. "Oh, my dear Emily, my stepmother," began her voice, calm and almost condescending. "Your father was a bit confused before he passed. He made a lot of promises, but perhaps he forgot about the date on that letter. But the letter was written just 2 weeks before he died. It clearly states that the money had already been set aside." I ed, refusing to back down. "Do you really believe that?" S's voice was cold as she stared at me with wide eyes. "Do you seriously think your father left you some secret fortune? Maybe he left you a yacht too, while he was at it." My stepmother cleared her throat. "Your father and I did our best for this family. You understand how expensive college can be, don't you? Sandy had potential, and it was necessary to support her future." At those words, I couldn't hold back any longer. I stood up abruptly, the sound of the chair scraping against the floor echoing through the room. "What about my potential? I've been working nonstop at that diner, and as a cleaner, I've been giving half of my paycheck to this household, while Sandy gets to chase her dreams." My voice cracked with every word. "Stop being so dramatic," my stepmother finally shouted, her voice rising in anger. "We've all made sacrifices. Sandy needed things that were absolutely essential. Well, I didn't get anything out of it." At those words, Sandy gave a sarcastic smirk, but her smile looked slightly strained. "It's not my fault. You couldn't do well in school. Someone in this family had to grow and succeed." The casual cruelty in her words pierced my chest, making it hard to breathe. I glanced at my stepmother, holding on to a sliver of hope that she would acknowledge the unfairness and defend me. But she remained calm, pretending as if nothing had happened at that moment. A phrase my father often said echoed in my mind. "Focus on the present. What's done is done." I quietly picked up the letter, letting my father's words sink deep into my heart. They had stolen my future and were now trying to erase its existence. I could see it clearly. They were reverting to their usual roles. Sandy, the family's golden child, her mother, the enthusiastic audience to her success story. As I watched them, something inside me began to shift. It hardened into something resolute and unyielding. "You're right, Dad," I said softly. "What's done is done, but what happens next is up to me." The drive to Aunt Jody's house after that confrontation with my family felt like an escape from reality. I couldn't bear another minute of my stepmother's cold silence or S's smug attitude. When I arrived at Jody's cottage, the garden was overgrown with weeds and the wind chimes swayed gently. This place had always been a safe haven for me. As I opened the front door, the sweet scent of cookies baking in the kitchen greeted me. "You found the letter, didn't you?" Jody said, as she looked at me, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron, her tone full of certainty. I couldn't speak, so I nodded. Silently, my voice felt stuck in my throat. "Come sit down, my dear. There's more you need to know." Jod pulled out a chair and gently urged me to sit. She disappeared into her study and returned few moments later, holding an old envelope. She placed it on the table. In front of me, "Your father left behind more than just the college fund there. Our bank statements, letters to trustees, and even recordings of conversations with your stepmother. It's all here." As I pulled out the documents and began examining them, my hands started to shake. The bank statements showed regular deposits made over the years, far exceeding the $50,000 I had been told about as the college fund. At that moment, I realized just how meticulously my father had planned, and just how much my stepmother had hidden. The documents revealed that 3 months after my father's death, all the funds were transferred into a new account and used to pay Forsey's college tuition. He knew she might do something like this, Jod said, her voice rising with anger. "That's why he made me promise to keep copies of everything." Overwhelmed by confusion and fury, I asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Sooner, Jod sighed deeply and replied, Your father told me to wait until you found the letter on your own. He believed you needed to be ready to stand on your own first. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car door closing outside the window. Through the open window, Jode, and I could hear my stepmother's voice. She was talking to a neighbor saying she'd something to discuss with me. Jod squeezed my hand tightly. If you're not ready, you don't have to face her, she said gently. But I was all ready. Picking up the documents and organizing them, my heart was pounding, yet I felt a strange sense of calm. In fact, it felt like perfect timing. I heard the sound of my stepmother's footsteps climbing the front steps, followed by SI's exaggerated sigh. Emily, my stepmother, called my name as she entered the room, but when she saw the documents spread out on the table, she froze her face, turning pale. Is this what you, were looking for? Or I asked it, holding up a bank statement. Their cords clearly showed the exact amounts withdrawn to pay for SI's college tuition. This was my college fund. You had no right to touch it. Sandy opened her mouth to argue, but Jod cut her off. It was her money, you stole it. My stepmother avoided my gaze and looked away as she muttered in a quiet voice I was planning to pay it back with my paycheck after. You finished paying for Essie's master's degree? I stood up from my chair, anger surging through me in a way I hadn't felt in years. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I watched as the meticulous lie-built wall of lies she had constructed began to crumble. At that moment, I realized something what my father had left me wasn't just money he had given me. The truth, and with it the power to finally set myself free. The fluorescent lights of the diner made everything look cold and lifeless during my evening shift. I mechanically poured coffee into mugs, feeling a strange sense of detachment from reality. Emily, are you okay? You look like you're about to collapse. A coworker busy preparing another order beside me asked with concern. I'm fine, I replied, though my gaze was fixed on a figure visible through the diner's door. At that moment, the bell above the door jingled. Sandy walked in. She was wearing a designer coat she had proudly received as a Christmas gift from my stepmother. The sight of her made my stomach twist. Sandy slid onto a stool at the counter and looked straight at me. I need to talk to you, she said. Her voice carried a note of irritation. You've made Mom upset, Shedded. I stayed silent, continuing to wipe down the counter. I didn't look at her. I'm working. Even so, Sandy continued in a loud voice. Mom isn't working, and the mortgage on the house is overdue. Is this what you wanted? At those words, I finally stopped and looked at Sandy. What are you talking about? My voice surprisingly calm cut through the diner background. Chatter Mom took out a second mortgage to pay for my final semester. Sandy leaned closer to me. She was counting on the income from your rent payments to cover it. In that moment, my mind went blank. The coffee pot in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Scalding liquid splashed against my ankles. But I barely registered the pain. All those shifts, all those extra hours, the money I had sweated and worked so hard to earn, had once again disappeared into Sans education, not once, but twice. Emily, take 5 minutes. Doris, my coworker, appeared with a mop and began cleaning the floor. She spoke gently, and I nodded, making my way to the break room, leaning against the wall. I opened my banking app with trembling hands. There it was, the record of the money I had deposited into my parents' account over the past 5 years. It was supposed to be for my education, for me future. But that too had been used for Sandy. The door opened quietly, and I turned to see Sandy standing there. She didn't look apologetic. Instead, her voice carried a hint of irritation as she said, "Get that you're upset about Dad's money, but just stop." I turned to face her, whispering with all the strength I could muster, "Stop, Sandy." Sighed and continued, looking me straight in the eyes. "Mom did it for me because I have potential. You didn't at that." Moment, the quiet anger buried deep within me ignited completely. Is that so? Or maybe you just decided that before giving me a chance. I murmured, watching his expression stiffen. For a moment, that's unfair, I said. Quietly stealing my future is beyond unfair. I untied my apron and told Doris that I'd be taking the rest of my shift off. Emily Waits' voice called after me, but I didn't turn around. My mind was spinning. I began mentally calculating the money I had stashed away in a separate account. It wasn't much, but it was probably enough to cover a year's living expenses. It would be enough for a down payment on a small apartment. It rusted that Aunt Jod would help me figure out the rest. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from me stepmother. "Family dinner tonight. We need to discuss your attitude." I stared at the message for a moment, then typed a brief reply. "There's nothing to discuss. I'm moving out. I've consulted a lawyer, and you'll be held accountable for using my inheritance." Then I blocked both of their numbers. I started the car and drove toward Aunt Jody's house. For the first time, the weight of lies and control that had been pressed on me for so many years felt like it was finally lifting in its place a vivid and heart-wrenching hope. Began to rise. I realized for the first time that revenge isn't about getting even. It's about setting yourself free. I sat on the bed in Aunt Jody's guest room, staring at the list of apartments on my phone. My vision blurred slightly as the realization hit me this was the first step toward a new life surrounded by hastily packed boxes. I had already completed the process of renting a small studio apartment downtown. It wasn't spacious, but it was affordable on my diner wages. And that was enough for the start of my freedom. Just as my finger hovered over the call button to contact the landlord about my mauve and date, the silence was shattered by a loud, insistent knock that echoed through the house. "Emily, I know you're in there," my stepmother's voice, sharp and desperate, rang out, and Jod appeared at the front door with a stern expression. "You don't have to talk to her," she said, firmly, but I had already made up my mind after 5 days of ignoring calls and messages. I couldn't avoid this any longer. It was time to put an end to this. When Aunt Jod opened the door, my stepmother stormed in her anger on full display. Sandy lingered in the doorway, hesitating as if unsure whether to join the scene or merely observe it like a theater performance. But I knew in my heart this was truly the end. Miss Stepmother brandished a stack of documents, her voice rising, as she said, "I've calculated every expense we've incurred on you since you turned 18, rent, utilities, groceries. You owe us nearly $440,000. At her words, I laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was one of sadness and disappointment intertwined. "You're handing me a bill branding me a son grateful for merely existing," my voice trembled, but my eyes remained fixed on my stepmother. "You stole $50, however, zero from me, and now you're telling me that I owe you something." As I spat out those words, the room seemed to warp around me. My stepmother's face flushed. Read as she shouted back, "We made an investment in your futures on the one with more potential." At that moment, the dam inside me broke and everything I had been holding back poured out. Don't you dare decide from the beginning that I wasn't worth investing in. It needed a family who believed in me, just once a family who would give me a chance. I stared coldly at my stepmother. Your so-called investment robbed me of my life. I reached into my bag and quietly pulled out my father's letter, unfolding it with deliberate care. "When you lied about this," I said, holding up the letter, "was that your investment?" I locked eyes with my stepmother before turning to face. "Sandy, you used my rent money to fund your education. Have you ever stopped to think about how much is sacrificed so you could chase your dreams, or were you too busy looking down on me from your pedestal?" My words brought a chilling silence to the room. In that quiet, I saw them both clearly for the first time. My stepmother's desperate need for control, his smug sense of superiority, everything was laid bare in that moment. "I'm leaving." Taking a deep breath, I calmly announced, "I've already signed a lease, and I've enrolled in night classes for the upcoming semester." My stepmother's voice rose sharply. "You can't do that." I stood firm and replied quietly, Dad believed in me fine then. Go, but don't think for a second that you'll be welcomed back." Miss Stepmother snapped coldly. I simply looked at my family in silence, feeling something click firmly into place deep within me. Then I replied quietly, "That's fine. I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore." Either I turned and began walking across the wooden floors of Jody's house with each echoing step we left behind everything I thought it needed and moved toward the life ahead of me. Moving day came with a harsh winter rain using The money I had saved from my diner shifts, I managed to withdraw what I needed before my stepmother froze my bank account. But since she had reported my car as stolen, I had to leave it behind standing in the empty room of my new studio apartment. Istered. At the few boxes I had packed, it felt like I had lost everything yet. At the same time, I believed in myself for taking the first step toward freedom. In the future ahead, my phone buzzed with a message from Sandy Moms in the hospital. She had a panic attack from the stress. I hope you're happy I deleted the message without replying, but my hands were trembling as I opened a box filled with kitchen supplies. A growing sense of knee spread through my chest. The diner had cut everyone's hours, and the first tuition payment for my night classes was due in 2 weeks. The narrow walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in on me, making it hard to breathe. Just then a sudden knock at the door made me flinch when I opened the door. Sandy was standing. There she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Mom sick, she said, without any greeting then, in AO voice. She added, "We might lose the house." She explained that the bank had pushed them toward a second mortgage. Meanwhile, Sandy said she'd have to drop out of her master's program. The shock made me grip the doorframe for support. "That's not my fault," I said, reflexively, without saying a word. Sandy pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of my stepmother lying in a hospital bed. "Dad would be ashamed of you for doing this to Mom," she said. Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "Don't you dare use Dad against me," I shouted. "Dad wanted us to be together instead. You destroyed everything." My voice cracked as I forced the words out. "When you stole my future?" Sandy shook her head sadly. "Mom gave your future to someone who could use it better. We were..." Right the moment she said those words, I slammed the door shut, but her words lingered echoing in my mind. The narrow apartment felt like a prison. The sound of rain hitting the window reminded me of everything I had lost my savings would barely cover. Next month's rent and the course catalog for me night classes seemed to mock me from the kitchen counter at 2:47 a.m. The microwave clock blinked as my phone lit up again. Sandy had posted a photo of my stepmother in the hospital on social media. The caption read, "Some people choose revenge over family." The caption read, "Some people choose revenge over family, please. Pray for Mom." Comments flooded in from family, relatives, and friends, all condemning me. Words like "shocked by her coldness" were repeated over and over. Even my usually kind cousin Lisa had written, "How could you do this?" I curled up on the bare mattress, clutching my father's letter to my chest. Had I been wrong? Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been selfish. Perhaps I never deserved to want more than the future. They decided for me as the rain continued to lash against the window. I found myself questioning why. I ever thought I could escape. Exactly a month after leaving home, I received a certified letter. It bore the official letterhead of Smith Associates law firm. At first, I hesitated to open it, assuming it was another ploy by my stepmother to drag me back home. But as I read the contents, I was stunned. "Dear Miss Smith, as the trustee of Ella Mitchell's estate, it is my duty to deliver this letter upon confirmation of your independent residence." My hands trembled as I continued reading. There was another account my father had left behind, separate from the college fund. It included real estate and investments in stocks. It was more than enough to ensure I could live independently and pursue my own life. My father had prepared everything to help me forge my own pathless. Then 2 hours later, there was a knock at the door. It was my stepmother. "I heard about the inheritance," she said, pushing past me to enter the apartment. Sandy followed close behind, and together, they surrounded me, forming their usual wall of accusations. "What's this all about? The lawyer called us first?" Sandy said with a smug grin. My stepmother added coldly, "It wasn't just a courtesy. It was a warning. Considering your recent behavior, I'm filing to become your guardian. You're clearly unfit to manage this amount of money in your current mental state." The moment I heard those words, the room felt like it was spinning. "You have no right to do that," I shouted. "I have every right, and I fully intend." Tommy's stepmother replied, pulling out a folder. Inside were records of my so-called unstable behavior statements from family and friends, and even medical records. She shoved the folder toward me, and I began flipping through the carefully curated evidence. "You've been planning this ever since you found out about the first letter," I said. "We trying to protect you." my stepmother said calmly, but in that moment, everything about the pattern that had bound my life became crystal clear. Protecting me meant forcing me back into a life where I worked until I broke, funding Sai's dreams, while letting my own wither and die and thinking I wasn't worth investing in, was a decision they made without my consent. It was now undeniable my stepmother would never stop trying to extinguish my dreams, holding my father's letter tightly. I stood my ground. If you don't leave, I'll call the police and I'll take these documents to a real lawyer to prove that you're trying to control me again. My stepmother's face twisted in frustration, but she slowly turned toward the door. Sandy threw a parting shot over her shoulder. You'll regret this decision. As they walked toward the door, I thought of my father, of his careful plans, and his belief in me for the first time in my life. I had said no. A year later, I was in the university library surrounded by textbooks and the gentle of students, preparing for my final exams, when a message from Aunt Jod appeared on my phone. Checked the letter I was cleaning out your father's old desk and found an unfinished letter he wrote just days before he passed. Unlike the other letters, this one abruptly cuts off mid-sentence. What caught my attention, though, was a book beside it, your father's well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. He once promised to pass it on to you. If you want it, it's yours that evening. I received the book from Jod as I flipped through the yellowed pages. A small envelope fell out. Inside was a photograph I had never seen before. It was a picture of my father in his younger days, proudly holding up the key to his first apartment. On the back of the photo he had written, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Now it's your turn." I thought about Sandy, who had dropped out of her master's program last week and started working as a waitress. She had sent me a single text message. I understand now I didn't reply, but I understood the meaning. Behind her words, the two of them had sold the house and moved from their spacious family home into a cramped apartment. Their new place was a single unit in an old building with a kitchen and living room combined. My stepmother had started working part-time at a small local supermarket where she could now be seen working as a cashier. It was her first job in 20 years, and a far cry from her once elegant demeanor. Their lives had changed completely, forcing both of them to confront the choices they had made. I could see how deeply their circumstances had shifted, and in some small way, I felt relief that this transformation might have taught them something I had worked with the lawyer my father had introduced me to and successfully reclaimed the inheritance mine stepmother had misused. I also obtained a restraining order against her, ensuring I would no longer have to deal with her as I traced the words on my father's letter with my finger. A thought struck me. My stepmother had always believed that if I faced hardships, I would crumble and eventually rebuild myself according to her design. But I hadn't followed her expectations. Instead, I had carved my own path. My grades from the one-stone semester were proof that my father had seen my potential all along. In my new environment, I found people who valued me for who I was. The book club I started at the local coffee shop had grown beyond a simple hobby group, becoming a close-knit circle of friends they accepted and supported. May not for what I could offer, but for who I was. Next month we would be reading Janaea at my suggestion, and I had one more thing to look forward to. Just then my phone buzzed again. A message from Sandy appeared on the screen. "Can we talk?" It was a short sentence, but her emotions came through. Clearly, I picked up my father's photo and looked at his proud smile once more. His smile gave me a new sense of certainty. Revenge wasn't about hurting someone. It was about saving yourself, and it was also about stopping the act of living someone else's story and starting to write your own. I sent our reply to Sandy Tuesday at 2 p.m. In Oak Street Coffee Shop. This might be a new step forward. Perhaps Sandy was ready to start her own story, or maybe she wasn't. Either way, it didn't matter. I had the key to my own life now, and a smile I could be proud of. And I had a new chapter of my own to write. I slipped my father's photo between the pages of Jane Eyre and headed home to study. The future was waiting for me, and this time it was entirely my own.